I'm Greene. I'm an historical archaeologist, and I've been lucky enough to work with people in the Eastern Band for several years now and do research on Cherokee history and archaeology. And so that's what I want to talk about today is a group of people who lived here, who stayed in North Carolina, and what their lives were like. So I'll go ahead and get started. In the fall of 1838, about 400 Cherokees in North Carolina fled from the U.S. Army, hid in the mountains, and avoided removal. Desperate to remain in the area, they risked starvation, they risked disease and military attack. And I think that some of the other speakers have already touched on a few of these people. I know that T.J. Holland yesterday talked about Dikagishka for a few minutes, one of the leaders of this resistance movement. What I want to talk about is what their lives were like afterwards. That first decade after removal, how difficult their lives were, the challenges they faced, how they survived that period, how they reestablished their communities. You know, they had the difficulties of not only having most of the tribe having been forcibly immigrated west, they were living in an area where really there weren't supposed to be any Cherokees. There was sort of a quick influx of whites, and a lot of those people didn't like this idea of a continued Cherokee presence. And so they faced a lot of real difficult issues at that time. So that's what I want to talk about is a few of these communities. First, I want to talk just briefly about some of the reasons for why they chose to hide out and remain in North Carolina. Now, certainly they wanted to stay in this area. They knew the area, it was their homeland. But I think there were other reasons as well. And again, some other speakers have touched on this over the last couple of days. I think that one of the reasons they chose this route was because they still believed in this traditional Cherokee idea of town autonomy, of local governance, of town autonomy, and not being tied to a larger sort of nation state or national government, whether it comes from the United States or from the Cherokee Nation. And so if you look at some of the leaders of this movement, Junaluska, Dikagishka, John Allen, John Axe, Lalo, these were headmen of these towns who had come of age either prior to or during this formal period of sort of Cherokee national state when it was forming, or Cherokee national government. And so they still believed in these earlier ideals of sort of local autonomy. A lot of these men or their family members were also had been citizen reservees in 1819, and so earlier on, 20 years before removal, they had actually sort of stepped away from the Cherokee Nation. And I think that's very telling in why they made these choices during the removal itself. Now, most of these people, I think also, in addition to maintaining traditional towns, they continue to practice other ideas in traditional Cherokee society, a community ethos, corporate responsibility, subsistence level farming, I think was very common among the people that I'm going to be talking about. So by the spring of 1839, there were several Cherokee communities in southwestern North Carolina. The largest population, okay, is that working?
Yes.
All right, good. I don't want to keep talking very loud and break everybody's eardrums, so I'll try to find that a little bit. Let me know if I'm too loud or too quiet. Start screaming into the mic. So the largest of these communities was in the Qua towns, and as you know, that was made up of 5 separate communities that in some ways, you know, were sort of incorporated in this larger idea of Qua Town. And most of those people lived on land owned by William Holland Thomas. There were several smaller towns in the area, Sandtown, just west of Franklin, North Carolina, Peachtree, and Hanging Dog Creek, which are along Valley River. But the towns I want to talk about today are 3 towns that were occupied by Cherokees who were involved in this, these events of hiding in the mountains and sort of outlasting the soldiers and waiting until the soldiers were gone and reestablishing these communities. So the first 2, Buffalo Town and Cherokees, were near present-day Robbinsville, and for people who have traveled from other parts of the country, Robbinsville is about 30 miles southwest of Cherokee as the crow flies. So that'll give you an idea about how far it is from here. I'm sorry I don't have a different scale map to show you exactly where it is. Welch's Town, the third one I'm talking about, is to the south of the first 2, and you can see those sort of colored areas. Welch's Town was a few miles south of Andrews, North Carolina, right along the Valley River. For the Cheoah Valley, most of the people from these first two towns, from Buffalo Town and Cheoah, they actually came from the same area prior to, or they had lived in the same area prior to removal. So in 1835, there were three main towns in the Cheoah Valley around what is present-day Robbinsville. Buffalo Town, which is located largely between East and West Buffalo Creeks and along that section of the Cheoah River Valley. Cheoah, which is really right now where Robbinsville is, and it was sort of located along Sweetwater Creek and Tallulah Creek, Robbinsville, and then Long Branch that came in from the southwest. And then this long sort of string of little communities along Tallulah Creek to the southeast, sometimes called Kenichi-Loy or Tallulah, and I think that really was sort of a collection of smaller settlements that were sort of, comprised this larger settlement called Tallulah or Kenichi-Loy. T.J. Holland yesterday talked about the people of Cheoah and how during the removal the area was occupied by the North Carolina militia commanded by Colonel John Gray Bynum, and during that time, during that occupation, the military occupation, he referred to the people of Buffalo Town as incorrigible savages. And of course that was because they refused to remove, and that was largely, a lot of the people I'm talking about are the people from Buffalo Town. Now, like I said, these people fled and hid in the mountains, and certainly for the people of Buffalo Town, I think that almost every family lost at least one member to starvation or disease, and so certainly they paid a very high price for making this choice and remaining in North Carolina. There were families from other areas like Notley River who moved over to the Cheoah Valley, but it's interesting that in this area after removal for that first decade, largely the population was made up of people who had lived in the area prior to removal. Okay, the third town I want to talk about, Welch's Town, which is that one just south of Andrews. It was made up mostly of people who had lived in along the Valley River and in other smaller communities right around there, Hanging Dog Creek, Beaver Dam, which is also called Wachese's Town, and a few families from Georgia. Now the town, most of the people in the town lived on land that was owned by John Welch, and John Welch was a Cherokee man who lived, you can see his house site just at the bottom there. It says Welch House, that little red square just above Valley River. John Welch lived in this area during the removal. His family was actually exempted from removal originally, but because they sort of were involved in aiding the people who were fleeing to the mountains, he was arrested by Winfield Scott and held in the prison in Fort Cass for about 4 months, where his health was destroyed for the rest of his life. Basically, he was blinded after getting some kind of disease, which wasn't really reported. We don't know much about that. But while he was in prison, the farm was pilfered. The Army took the livestock and crops and everything like that. But he was released and wasn't moved west, so he made his way back home. They reestablished this farm, and in 1839, they repurchased their farm, basically about 1,300 acres, including some of these tracts farther north up in the uplands. And so if you see these two sort of shaded areas, this is probably where most of the population of Welch's Town was living in the 1840s. So in the west, you have a small creek valley called Welch's Mill Creek, and to the east, that shaded area is called Townhouse Branch. And so we have some documentation that says, the members of Welch's Town lived on land owned by the Welches through the 1840s. And this is about the only place it could be. Although we haven't had a chance to do much archaeological testing there yet, but I think that's where most of the folks lived. Welch's Town in 1840 included 33 families and 129 individuals. The population of Welch's Town changed throughout the decade following removal, and this happened for all these towns, I think. There are a lot of records, a lot of censuses and rolls of these towns all through the 1840s and 50s. Most were recorded by William Holland Thomas, but by other individuals as well. And you see this sort of movement, this sort of fluid movement of different families and individuals moving from Buffalo Town and Cheoah to Valley River to Welch's Town, and sometimes to the Qua Ila towns or smaller communities. And so, we don't understand exactly why that was. Certainly there were family connections between these different groups, and so it may not be that unusual. But by and large, the populations of these towns remained relatively firm throughout the 1840s. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the lives of these people, how they survived, this period. And so we have both archival documents from the period and archaeology that we can bring in to talk about this. In 1840, a local white farmer living along the Valley River wrote an angry letter about the Welch Town Cherokees, and he said they were forming settlements, building townhouses, and show every disposition to keep up their former manners and customs of councils, dances, ball plays, and other practices, which is disgusting to civilized society and calculated to corrupt our youth and produce distress and confusion among all good-thinking people. So it's not too difficult to see exactly what he thinks about a continued Cherokee presence. And you have to be careful and take, he's worried about the children. Somehow it's going to corrupt our youth. I'm not sure what that means. But anyway, even though this is a horribly racist statement, I think his comments do tell something about what the Cherokee towns were like at the time. We don't have that many descriptions of the towns in the 1840s, and so I think this is an accurate description. First of all, the center of the town was the townhouse. Charles Landman, a writer who visited the area in the 1840s, described the townhouse in Qua Ila as built of hewn logs, very large and circular, without any floor but that of solid earth, and without any seats but one short bench intended for the great men of the nation. And so the townhouse in each of these towns, I think, was the center of town government, and this comes back to this idea of local autonomy, of people, dealing, making rules and finding different kinds of behavior sort of face-to-face and not this any sort of larger structure, and I'll come back to that again in a few minutes. The townhouse at Cheokees was a meeting place not only for local townspeople but for Cherokees from other towns as well, including sometimes from the Qua Ila towns. And so this is a map of the Cheokees Valley, or a section of the temple map from 1876, and it shows Cheokees, and I don't know if you can see it, but in this section right at the mouth of Mountain Creek, it's called the Townhouse Lot. And so certainly by the early 1870s, the townhouse of Cheokees seemed to be this the center of government for the Cherokees in southwestern North Carolina. And later on into the 1880s, it sort of decreased in importance, but for a long time there, I think the townhouse there was sort of the central structure. If there was sort of an overarching government at the time, it sort of met at the Cheokees Townhouse. The center of Welch Town was located along Townhouse Branch, and I showed you that map there with Townhouse Branch. And again, we haven't had a chance to do much archaeological excavation there, and there isn't a lot of archival documentation to tell us exactly how the town was laid out. But I think just the fact that it's called Townhouse Branch and just next to that is an area called Townhouse Ridge is pretty telling about how the community was set up there. Cherokees were also reconstructing other traditional places, dance grounds and stickball fields. And I think, again, that the reconstruction of these places is significant. It shows that the people within each of these towns is still identifying themselves with a particular community. In addition to family and clan, I think that town membership was really important to the people who stayed in North Carolina. Stickball games continued to strengthen social ties. They maintained a competitive spirit between towns. And I think this is revealed in the accounts of memorable stickball games, the one in Tallulah in 1845, supposedly in which 3 players were killed, or the game between Wolftown and Big Hope during the Civil War, which ended only when there was an abrupt attack by Northern soldiers. Cherokees also reestablished formal town-level social structures to deal with community affairs. And this is talked about in the Wolftown Chronicles. And this is a body of documents collected in the late 1880s by anthropologist James Mooney. Most of the documents, which were written in syllabary, most in the early 1850s, talk about the functioning of the Wolftown Council. The letters reveal a formal community-level government, although they don't talk a lot about sort of how positions are elected or how people are elected. The letters also talk about the functions of the Gadugi, the communal work parties. They talk about how these organizations maintain funds to loan to people who are in need. And so these papers, they talk about, although they talk about Wolftown in particular, I think that you can apply those sort of formal structures to each one of these towns that were sort of being reestablished right after the removal. Most of the Cherokees in these towns in some ways lived like they did before removal. Most were living in single-room log cabins with stick and clay chimneys. They had a small garden nearby. They were planting cornfields, and in this case, as in most cases, I think cornfields are planted right up to the walls of the cabin. In addition, families continued to hunt and fish, collect wild plant foods and herbs. And I want to talk for a second about the archaeology. At the Welch house site, I showed you the map there where John Welch and his family lived. We did archaeological excavations there a few years ago. I worked with archaeologists from the University of North Carolina, and we identified the site in 2003, I think. We excavated there in 2004 and 2006. The main excavations were 3 cellar pits that had been beneath an external kitchen. And so when they lived there in the 1840s, they had the main house and then a log kitchen separate. And so we identified the kitchen area, we excavated these 3 cellar pits. The material, the artifacts, and the soils that came out of the pits dated to the late 1840s or the early 1850s, so this period I'm talking about. And there was really good preservation of food remains. And so, we identified remains of cow, pig, chicken, corn and beans and squash, also a lot of wild foods, deer, bear, turkey, rabbit, squirrel, largemouth bass, turtle. And so you can see that, I think that the Cherokees at the time had this sort of abundance of both wild foods and domesticated foods. Cherokees continued to hunt with firearms and blowguns, continued to run cattle and hogs in the mountains where they could feed on mast such as chestnuts every fall. In the summer of 1851, somebody who just called himself Alexis, a student from the University of North Carolina, visited the Cherokee settlement of Sandtown just outside of Franklin, and he traveled with his party to Franklin from Chapel Hill, and for some reason they spent the day just sort of walking through Sandtown, looking at the cabins, barging into the cabins without talking to anybody, and so he records what the cabins were like, the town, and also the interiors of some of these cabins. And so, again, while it's very patronizing, he probably describes relatively accurately what the interior of these looked like. And so when he talked about Yonacona Heat or Long Bear's cabin, he said, a small, uncomfortably close room answered for the bedchamber, dining room, pantry, boudoir, and all, save for the kitchen and meat house. And again, you have this external kitchen. The cups, saucers, plates, knives, forks, and other things were of a peculiar whiteness and were all carefully placed away in the rough cupboard which the Long Bear had fastened to the wall. Then there were his rifle, brightly polished and deposited over the door, his blowgun, a hollowed cane with well-thistled arrows, occupying a place on the joist above, and his bow and arrows, whose twang and unerring aim had brought many a squirrel, bird, and rabbit to grace his table. Now, in all the things that Alexis wrote, he didn't comment, he didn't observe, or at least he didn't document the presence of handmade Cherokee ceramics. And again, I come back to these excavations at the Welch House. When we did those excavations, we recovered a lot of ceramics, but they were all imported wares, English wares, China, and things like that. We didn't recover any of these handmade ceramics that Cherokees had been making for decades or centuries. And it's interesting that, there have been several excavations of pre-removal Cherokee house sites in the same area here in southwestern North Carolina. In all of those cases, there are a lot of remains of handmade pottery. And so it might just be a coincidence, or it could be that, many of the potters who were making ceramics before removal were forcibly immigrated to the West, or maybe this craft drops off for another reason. We don't really know right now. And although we didn't recover handmade ceramics, in this setting at least, we did recover other handmade items, and so the men at the Welch House site were carving stone pipes that were similar to those, similar in form to those before the removal. They also carved other items out of stone, such as net sinkers and gaming discs and talc markers. So we do see this sort of continued craft in stone making or stone working. Now, while all this was going on, while Cherokees were trying to sort of rebuild their lives and reestablish their communities, they weren't left alone by the federal government. And so in the fall of 1841, Thomas Hyman was sent from Washington, D.C. To try to enroll people for what he called, or what the government called, voluntary removal. And so his first stop, he traveled to Murphy and then up the Valley River and stopped at John Welch's, where he met and talked with about 40 members of Welchestown, which at the time was less than half of the population of Welchestown, and told them what the government planned to do. Now these are photographs of John and Annie Axe. who were members of Welch's Town at the time. These photographs were taken in the late 1880s by James Mooney, and so they date to roughly 50 years after removal. So the Axes were a relatively young couple at the time, but were probably at this meeting. John Al, who was chosen to represent Welch's Town during this meeting with Heinemann, responded to Heinemann that those of the Cherokees who composed that settlement had separated from their nation and was now opposed to removal. Neither did they consider their interest as identified with the people of other settlements. And so I think, again, this is this idea that we identify with a certain settlement or town. This membership is important to us, and so we're more concerned with how, with how we govern ourselves, and we're not too worried about other communities, basically. After that, Heinemann left and went to the Chioa Valley and talked to the people of Buffalo Town and Chioa, who gave him the same response, no way. And so he continued this quest sort of through January 1842 and finally gave up and resigned his post with Washington with the government and returned to his home in Alabama and continued farming. During this period, the Cherokees were also involved in trying to recover tens of thousands of dollars owed them by the government for lost property. Now, this task for the Cherokees was even more difficult because of the arrival of many people who wanted to get involved in this, lawyers, people saying they were lawyers, who wanted to represent the Cherokees, and so they could charge these exorbitant fees for recovering these funds. There's one case from this period I want to talk about that shows these activities, how these activities work for lawyers and businessmen. A man named J.W. King, who was an associate of William Holland Thomas, lived in Murphy and tried to get the Valley River Cherokees, the Welch's Town Cherokees, to sign over power of attorney to Thomas, who was in Washington at the time. And in a letter to Thomas marked confidential, King wrote, "If we do not succeed in realizing some means from the Cherokee business, I tell you I don't know what we are to do. I want you to inform me about Henry Smith's preemption claim, whether or not, in your judgment, it will do to depend on or not, as I have already got him in debt to our house, some $400 or $500, and of opportunities that would suit our interest to get more debts on him, provided that the debt is safe, and it would not be too long before we could get the money." And I think this statement is representative, and it shows how desperate some of these people were, and also the potential wealth that these people could get from Cherokees if they could get involved, get legal representation for dozens or hundreds of people, which happens sometimes. If you could get power of attorney for an entire town, then you could make a lot of money off of that sort of interaction. And this occurred more than once. This is a document giving power of attorney to William Holland Thomas. It was signed in July of 1841 by every adult member of Buffalo Town. And Buffalo Town at the time contained a total of about 200 people who were entitled to funds resulting from the removal. And so you can see that there's potential wealth there that's pretty incredible for this period. But by the early 1850s, I think the social environment for the Cherokees in North Carolina had begun to shift. Although their citizenship status remained undefined, their continued residence in North Carolina was largely unquestioned, if not legally sanctioned by the state. About this time also, a few Cherokees had begun to purchase their own land. The first was Wachacha, who purchased 2 tracts from Gideon Morris in the Chioa Valley in 1845. In 1847, Wachacha's brother Junaluska purchased a tract in the same area. However, the purchase of land by Cherokees really didn't begin in earnest until the early 1850s. This is a photograph excuse me, of Chudasota, or Jim Woodpecker, and he purchased land in Sandtown from William Seiler in 1851. In 1852, Nancy Hawkins, Joe Locust, a Cherokee named Sapsucker purchased land. In 1853, John Axe bought a 50-acre tract on Hanging Dog Creek, and again, this was a small community just west of Welch's Town. And so land ownership, I think, if only by a small number of Cherokees at this time in the late 1840s and early 1850s, sort of signals this idea that there's a new sort of a new social environment. They're not quite as pressed, they're not quite as worried about forced removal or so-called voluntary removal and things like that as they were in the 1840s. These changes, along with the growing white population along the Valley River, I think caused the dissolution of Welch's Town by about 1855. John Welch died in the summer of 1852, And we don't know exactly what he died from, but I assume that it was some result, it was tied to what happened to him in the prison camps in 1838, sort of at the hand of Winfield Scott. As I said, he never really recovered his health after that event. John Al, who had lived in Welch's Town in the 1840s, had moved to Hanging Dog Creek and then to Vengeance Creek, which is just south of Welch's Town across the Valley River. Had moved to Vengeance Creek in the 1850s, and by 1856 he had moved with his family to the Qua Ila Towns. And by this time, most of the members of Welch's Town also had moved either to the Qua Ila Towns or to Cheoah, as had several of the children of John and Betty Welch. At that time, most of the children had come of age. And I think, again, this is pretty common for the period where people sort of moving to different areas, moving back and forth like John Al, moving 2 or 3 locations over the course of a decade. But once Welch's Town sort of ceases to exist as an entity, most of those people either move to Buffalo Town and Cheoah or to the Qua Ila Towns. And like I said, many of the Welch children moved to the Cheoah Valley, and this includes Lloyd Welch, who served as principal chief for the Eastern Band in the late 1870s. Cheoah maintained a stable population throughout the rest of the 19th century. So the occupation in Cheoah Valley, the Cherokee occupation in 1880 was about 190 people. And then the population there began to grow more rapidly in the 20th century. These towns that I've been talking about here, especially the 3 towns, Buffalo Town, Cheoah, and Welch's Town, I think were crucial to the survival of the Cherokees who had remained in hiding during removal. Cheoah and Buffalo Town were the towns most isolated from white incursion, and today the area is the home of the snowbird Cherokees. In some obvious ways, life changed very dramatically for these people. The majority of their kinsmen was gone. Most had lost immediate family members to either immigration or death. They were forced onto smaller parcels of land as whites moved in rapidly after removal. In many other ways, though, I think their life changed relatively little. You know, they continued to live in communities where kin and clan and town membership were important sort of identity markers. Each of the towns was centered on a townhouse. They maintained dance grounds and stickball fields, organizations like the council and the Gadugi, all of these formal structures for these small towns. They continued to make a living in much the same manner as they had before the removal, small-scale farming, as well as hunting and fishing. And so the people who established these towns, I think they achieved what they had set out to do. They remained in North Carolina, they reestablished their communities, and helped maintain a Cherokee presence in the mountains. Thank you.